Let's look at my approach to painting different materials and textures. Let's look at knit and lacy materials first. Lacy and knit surfaces have a pattern, which must be followed to create the effect. First, let's look at the fan. Here's the photo reference. And when you look at the photo reference, you'll see that the fan has a definite pattern of lights and darks, which must be closely reproduced, which you can see here, in all of its relative shape and relative location. This has to be done to produce the effect. I say relative because it doesn't have to be absolutely perfect to work, but it has to be relatively close. In this example of a knit shawl, the effect is achieved by the relative location and number of the dark shapes, while indicating the existence of the smaller knit holes by painting the highlights around them. Let's look at another way to indicate surfaces and objects. Okay, the polka dots on this dress create the illusion of folds by their position and orientation, also by their oval or part oval. They're the only reference to surface, since they are mostly surrounded by black. To paint an earring, you need to see the patterns here as well. First, notice the shapes of black. You have to look at these as individual shapes. And the shapes of the highlights as well. You have to look at these as individual shapes. You can't assume that it is a ring. But most importantly, notice the shapes of the skin between, because the skin between has to be painted as separate shapes as well. You can't paint the cheek first and then add the earring on top. They all have to be looked at separately. And you have to paint them as individual shapes. Even the loose pattern of a fringe must be faithfully rendered to give the same effect. Here's the photo reference, here's the painting. Notice how close the highlights and the shadows are within the photo reference and the painting. There's shadow there, that shadow line, that grouping of shadows down there. Finally, let's see how to paint hair. Here are 3 examples of hair. Notice there's no delineation between black hair and black top. And the dark hair dissolves into the shadow of the ear. So you have to leave the lost edges lost. This applies to the rest of the painting as well. Now notice the deliberate pattern and color of the strands of hair in the light, and the strands of hair that escape the mass, even in the shadows. You have to paint the strands as well as the negative shapes between them, as individual shapes. These must be rendered faithfully, the same as the fringes in the previous example. Next, let's look at hair surface. To achieve the look of a mass of hair, you must treat it as a mass and analyze the shadows and highlights. Here's shadows of the photo reference. Put in the shadows in the photo or in the painting. Here's the highlights in the photo reference, and there's the highlights in the painting. It's important to look at the mass rather than individual strands and paint the highlights and shadows of the mass. Finally, let's look at hair as strands. As they stick out into the light, notice the shapes of the negative spaces between them, the strands of hair. The shapes aren't identical to the photo reference, but they are relatively similar. So, the locations, shapes, and colors of all items are what makes the painting work.